Okay. So our Torah portion this week, we start the fifth book of the Torah, the book of Devarim, or Deuteronomy, as it's known in English. I just want to say that, let me just mute everybody, and then if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and just interrupt at any time. I just do want to say that as this virus goes on, and the more that we're, just doing services over Zoom, etc., it's just very sad what we're missing by not being able to be together in person. I mean, just the physical proximity that we need with each other, but also the Jewish calendar is going by, and we're trying to be together as a community on Zoom, but it's not exactly the real thing. And who knows? I just sent out a proposal to Paul and Josh Lansky and the Cantor a little while ago about what high holiday services are going to look like by Zoom. So it's just very sad. Well, let me say it, bittersweet. I mean, it's our attempt to make sure that we stay together, and we have the spiritual opportunities that we need, but at the same time, missing the days that we can be together. So, the book of Deuteronomy. If we're in if we have the Eitz Chaim, let's turn to page 980. And if you don't have the Eitz Chaim, then just look for the book of Deuteronomy in the table of contents. And there's a lengthy introduction, a whole page on 980, by Bible professor Jeffrey Tigay. He just one more person. I think Barbara's daughter is joining us. Jeffrey Tigay is a graduate. I'm almost sure he's a graduate of the rabbinical school of the Jewish Theological Seminary, and then hi Jan, and he got his PhD in Bible, and he's been a tenured professor at University of Pennsylvania ever since. So, like I said, we're on page 980 in the Eitz Chaim, or whatever edition of Chumash you have. Look for the book of Deuteronomy. There's a series that JPS came out with. The translation here in Eitz Chaim is the Jewish Publication Society translation, and I have on my shelf this more scholarly edition of books of the Bible that came out from the Jewish Publication Society, and this is the volume on Deuteronomy. Look how thick it is, and it is edited by Dr. Jeffrey Tigay. So there is so much to say about the book of Deuteronomy. It could be a whole semester class about it, but let's just say this about the Deuteronomy in context in the Torah itself, and that's what the introduction will look at. But before we even look at the introduction, hi Alan. Before we even look at the introduction that's here on page 980 in the Eitz Chaim, I do want to make sure that we understand what the context is. So, last week's portion, as we ended the book of Numbers. One more person is joining. Last week's portion, as we ended the book of Numbers, hey Dennis, brought us to a close in the narrative of Numbers that we had in the portion Pinchas, the story of the daughters of Tzalafchad approaching Moses about inquiring about inheriting their father's portion in the land of Israel, and Numbers ends with them marrying fellow men from their tribe of Manasseh. They are from the tribe of Manasseh, and they married men from the tribe of Manasseh to ensure that their father's landholding stays in the tribe of Manasseh. And it ends with verse 13, or 967 says, "These are the commandments and regulations that the Lord enjoined upon the Israelites through Moses on the steppes of Moab at the Jordan near Jericho." And if we're in the Bible, and we go to the book of Joshua, so I just took off my shelf the book of Joshua, we would have, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant, "My servant Moses is dead. Prepare to cross the Jordan together with all this people into the land that I am giving to the Israelites. Every spot on which your foot treads I give to you, as I promised Moses. Your territory shall extend from the wilderness and the Lebanon to the great river," etc., etc. So all we need from the book of Deuteronomy to transition from the end of Numbers to the beginning of Joshua, which is the next book in the Bible, is a description of the death of Moses. That's all we need. Everything else in the book of Deuteronomy is extra. And so that there's no narrative in the, no, let me say this. The narrative is very sparse in the book of Deuteronomy. It begins, "These are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan." That's narrative. And then it describes where they are on the other side of the Jordan. And then God tells Moses at the end of the book to write a poem or share this poem that will summarize Jewish history and Jewish values to the people. And then the very last chapter, which we read on Simchat Torah, is a description of Moses climbing Mount Nebo, looking out over the land of Israel, and dying, and the people mourning Moses' death. So there's a verse here at the beginning of Deuteronomy. There's near the end about writing a song, and then Moses' death. Everything in between is a reiteration or new laws being presented to the people. So that all of that raises a question as to why the book of Deuteronomy is here, and even more daringly, who wrote the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, so now, if we're traditionalists, which I am not, well, let me just say, in terms of understanding not in terms of Jewish practice, I am a traditionalist that way, but I mean in terms of understanding the authorship of the Torah, I am not a traditionalist that way. So what I mean by this is, if we were traditionalists, then we have to understand that the entire Torah, all 5 books, were given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai, and we would then have to make sense of this book. Well, we wouldn't even question whether this book belongs in the Torah or not. If, though, we are approaching the Torah from a scholarly perspective, we still see the Torah as a holy, sacred book, but understand that the Torah may have been written by Moses or may have been written by people in subsequent generations. It's still an old book. It still is respected and revered. It's still sacred text to be studied and a foundation for Judaism. Doesn't take away anything from it if we suggest that God didn't write it. But when we make that suggestion, then it offers up to us more possibilities in understanding what the Torah is and who wrote the Torah and the context for this. So with that being said, I'd like to look at Tigay's introduction on page 980 and also a little bit on the bottom of 981 to understand now what the book of Deuteronomy is. And I'll offer a question about when the book of Deuteronomy might have been written. So On page 980, it's the page, actually, it doesn't have a page number on the bottom of it, but it's that whole page there, the Tigay's introduction. Deuteronomy has two Hebrew names. Sefer Devarim, if you look on 981, you see Devarim there in Hebrew without vowels, because it's the second word of the Torah. And it means, in modern Hebrew, Devarim means things. In ancient Hebrew, it means words. So these are the words. Ele hadavarim asher diber Moshe. So diber, divarim, same word. Okay, speaking, lidaber is to speak. Divarim, even though it's not dibarim, but divarim, but grammatically the bet and the vet. Sometimes it's a bet, sometimes it's a vet, based on grammar. It's the same word. These are the words that Moses spoke. So it's in Hebrew, it's called Sefer Devarim, or taken from its opening, from the opening phrase of the book, and Mishneh Torah, repetition of the Torah, which Deuteronomy is the Greek version of. That's what Deuteronomy means in Greek, repetition of the Torah, taken from chapter 17, verse 18 in the book. And if I turn ahead to 17:18 to see that source, we see when he, 1093, when he is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. Haya keshifto al kisei mamlachto, v'chatav lo et mishneh haTorah. So a copy of this teaching is how it's translated, and that's the source of in that section on the laws for kings of Israel. They're supposed to have their own copy of the Torah with them all the time. That's the source for the idea of Mishneh Torah, and also the idea for Moses, for Maimonides' scholarly work on the summary of Jewish law. His summary of Jewish law is called Mishneh Torah. And so it consists of 5. So what is the book of Deuteronomy about, according to Tigay? It consists of 5 retrospective discourses and poems that Moses addressed to Israel in Moab shortly before his death. So just if we, I just want to turn ahead to the maps in the back of the Chumash. If you look at the first map that we have here, you see the land of Israel, and you see Moab here on the very bottom on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, okay? And where he is, Mount Nebo, it's written there in very, very small print on the northeastern shores of the Dead Sea, up in the mountains here, with easy access down the mountain to the Jordan Valley here. And this is about where it says Heshbon here on the map. If you have your own Eitz Chaim, you can see it. Heshbon is right above Mount Nebo, and that is where the people then in the book of Joshua will cross over into the land of Israel. We don't exactly know where Mount Nebo is. The Pope, I believe it was John Paul II, I think, took a trip to Jordan to be on top of Mount Nebo. It's just what we think is Mount Nebo based on what the Torah is describing, where Moses could have been looking out over to see the promised land. So that's where he is. And so it has here in parentheses what the different sections of the book of Deuteronomy are, pretty clearly, from the beginning of our portion to the end of chapter 4. Near the end of chapter 4 is one unit. From chapter 4 to chapter 28 is a second unit. A third unit is chapters 29 to 30. And then you have 32, 33 is a fourth one, plus two narratives about his final acts, right, of climbing the mountain and dying. The book's core is the second discourse, in which Moses conveys laws that the people commissioned him to receive from God at Mount Sinai 40 years earlier. So there's a discourse, what Moses is telling the people about how to prepare to enter the land, and also teaching laws to the people. Okay, and I just want to point out that on the bottom of 981, some of Deuteronomy's passages, ranging from the Decalogue, so that the Ten Commandments are repeated here, to setting aside cities of refuge, duplicate contents found elsewhere in the Torah. But 70 of the approximately 100 laws in Deuteronomy are not found in the earlier books. Okay, so it's not just a repetition of what came before. There are actually 70 new mitzvot, 70 laws of the 613 that are unique to the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, now I want to look back on 980 now, the second paragraph from Tigay. Several themes in Deuteronomy stand out. Among the Torah's books, it's the most vigorous and clear advocate of monotheism and of the ardent, exclusive loyalty that Israel owes to God. It emphasizes God's love, justice, and transcendence. God is near to Israel, but in a spiritual, not a physical sense. Only God's name, not God himself, dwells in the sanctuary. Okay, which I'll get to this in a moment. One more paragraph. The book stresses the covenant between God and Israel, summed up in chapter 26, established with the patriarchs, affirmed at Sinai and in Moab. It is to be reaffirmed as soon as Israel enters its land. So here's where I just want to open this up a little bit more about the difference. It's clear in the book of Exodus, when the people build the tabernacle, that God's presence comes down to rest on the tabernacle as soon as the work is completed. And then the book of Leviticus describes all the sacrifices that are being offered and God's presence that is there dwelling with them in the sanctuary. Here in Deuteronomy, God is presented, as Tigay points out, in a different way. And that you have God's name dwelling in the sanctuary. Like in the portion Re'eh, we're told that God commands the people to build a sanctuary in the one place that God commands it to be, right? In the land of Israel, set up the sanctuary there where God's name will reside. It doesn't say where God's presence will reside. It says where God's name will reside. So there are these differences in approach to understanding God and our relationship to God that is here in Deuteronomy, that is not in other places. And among some of the new laws are laws dealing with when you set up a king in the land of Israel. Nothing about setting up a king in any of the other books of the Torah with those laws there. Even though in the book of Numbers, we have laws. When you get to the land of Israel, you should be doing such and such. Nothing about kings there. So this raises the question then for scholars to suggest that perhaps Deuteronomy was written a couple of hundred years after the Torah was given to Moses or the life of Moses. So in other words, there are many scholars who suggest, and there's no accepted standard of belief here because it's all hypothesis. So, but most scholars suggest that Deuteronomy was written after the rest of the Torah. So let's say that the Torah was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. That happened around 1300, between 1300 and 1200 BCE, somewhere around there. And we only know that from looking at the archaeological ruins around the city of Jericho and dating some of the finds there to what looked like a war or some kind of devastation or destruction in the city that can be carbon dated to around that time. So that's, through archaeology and dating of finds, that's how archaeologists come up with the chronology. So by seeing the destruction of Jericho, which the book of Joshua describes, and going back a few more years, you can kind of approximate when Moses and the Israelites could have marched through the desert. There's no proof that Moses existed. There's no proof that the Israelites marched through the desert. But if we're assuming this to be history, then we can date it to around that time, okay? Then it takes a couple of hundred years while the Israelites are settling the land of Israel to live under Joshua and the judges until the rise of King David. So King David's about the year 1000. And when Jerusalem celebrated in 1999 its 3000th birthday, it's based on accepted history from historians and archaeologists as to when King David may have lived and may have established the city of Jerusalem. So some suggest that the book of Deuteronomy was written post-David in a response to how the Israelites are living in the land of Israel at that time, how they have strayed from God's path, and how this book then comes to re-inspire the people and reinvigorate spiritual life. Because if you read the book of Kings, post-Solomon, most of the kings of Israel, both of what becomes the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Israel, are pretty bad people, Jewishly speaking. They neglect God. They allow idolatry to take place both in the temple that is set up in the northern kingdom and in the temple in Jerusalem. And it's only the rare king that is pointed out, like Hezekiah, who is considered to be a righteous person and follows in God's ways. And there's also King Josiah, who happens to find a book when he decides to clean out the temple in Jerusalem and do away with the idolatry there. He finds a book a book of the Torah there hidden away in the temple, and scholars think that perhaps that's a reference to this book of Deuteronomy. Did King Josiah and the Kohanim and the religious leaders of Israel at the time write the book of Deuteronomy at that time to inspire the people to come back to God? Or was this the book of Deuteronomy that had been written already that just happened to have been found? So there's no right answer to that, but it seems to make sense that from the stylistic differences that are here in Deuteronomy versus the rest of the Torah, the emphasis on kings of Israel and the laws given to the kings of Israel here, that an argument, a cogent, logical argument can be made that the book of Deuteronomy not only is different from the rest of the Torah, but could have been written later. Now, does this affect in any way our religious attitude to the book of the Torah? I'll get to you in a second, Gabe. Well, okay, go ahead now. Unmute yourself and ask your question.
When was it that the 5 books were put together as the Torah?
Right. So that follows right on this whole theory of when the book of Deuteronomy was written. So traditionalists say the Torah came from God to Moses at Mount Sinai. The slightly less traditionalists would say Moses took dictation on Mount Sinai, and slightly less traditionalists would say Moses and the people of Israel edited the Torah there during their 40 years of wandering in response to the revelation of God at Mount Sinai. So all of those could be traditional understandings of when the Torah was written, all involving Moses in the writing or editing of the Torah. That's the traditional perspective. But if we take the non-traditional perspective, well, scholars suggest that either one theory is that King David and his court edited the oral traditions that had been passed down up to his time. So perhaps a first version of the Torah could have been from King David's time, which would have been around the year 1000 BCE. Perhaps it's King Hezekiah, who may have, or King Josiah before him, who may have had their followers or their court edit the oral traditions, and that would have been around 700 BCE, so 300 years after King David, 700, 600 BCE. Or there are some suggest that it was all edited in a time of Ezra. So Ezra was among the leaders of the people when the people of Israel were released from Babylonian exile by the Persians and were given permission to return to the land of Israel and to live there again. So Ezra and Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah, two of the last books of the Bible, describe settling the land, reinstituting the laws of the people to be an autonomous people. And Ezra teaches about reading the Torah every week as regular kind of worship. So some suggest, scholars suggest, no, rabbis suggest that Ezra sets up the Sanhedrin, and that whole rabbinic tradition comes from the time of Ezra. But scholars suggest that perhaps the Bible, the Torah was written in Ezra's time, and that would have been around 500 BCE. So those are three prominent theories: either the time of King David, this is all non-traditionalist biblical scholarship perspective on when the Torah was written, either King David's time, or Josiah Hezekiah's time, or Ezra's time. So all of it then, it's still ancient text. So it's still at least the Torah, the Torah is at least 2,500 years old. If we take the latest time, that's the time of Ezra. Or it could be 3,000 years old if we take the time of Moses to be the time. So if it's the time of Moses, the difficulty is that it describes Moses's death. So how could Moses be the author of the entire Torah if he's also writing about his death? So rabbis themselves, medieval commentators, and even rabbis in a time of the Mishnah and the Talmud suggest that perhaps Joshua wrote the last few sentences of the Torah. What Paul always reads for us in on Simchat Torah, a section that last section of the Torah, which is the person receiving the Chatan Torah Aliyah. So after everybody has an Aliyah, you go around and around and around. That last portion then that is read, that hadn't been read yet, perhaps those last sentences were written by Joshua. So they're already, that's part of the traditionalist view that the Torah, Moses wrote the entire Torah except the last 10 sentences, which were written by Joshua. So there are all these theories around. Did Moses get the entire Torah, including the description of his own death? Yes, some traditionalists say that, because Moses was the greatest of all prophets, and he was able to withstand that knowledge of when he was going to die. Most mortal human beings would go crazy and insane, knowing they only have they know when their date of death is going to be. How can you live with that knowledge that that's when the date of your death is going to be? Just a second, Barbara. So, but Moses, the great individual that he was able to withstand withstand that. So the most traditionalists say that Moses wrote the entire Torah. The others, which have rabbinic authority behind it, suggest that Joshua wrote the last few sentences. Yes, Barbara, unmute yourself to ask it. Go ahead.
What is the estimated date that the Dead Sea Scrolls were written?
So we don't know when they were written, but we know carbon dating that they're about 2,000 years old. So all that proves is that the manuscript of the Torah as we have it was already there in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So but that doesn't help us in understanding when the Torah was written. So we know that the Torah in the form that we have it is at least 2,000 years old. Okay, so that's fantastic, and that just that still bolsters the sacred element of the text of the Torah itself, and how it serves as the sacred foundational text of our tradition. So we know that it's 2,000 years old. There could be slight variances, a word here and there, a letter here and there that's slightly different, but that certainly is nothing to impact how ancient the text is. So it's at least 2,000 years old. But we also know that an amulet was found on the grounds of the temple in Jerusalem. You know, the Muslim authority, the Muslim religious authority, known in Arabic as the Waqf, which is spelled in English W-A-Q-F, is in charge of the Temple Mount itself. So you know that Israel kept the status quo after the Six-Day War, and since there's a mosque up there besides the shrine of the Dome of the Rock, Israel did not take upon itself the authority to destroy those places, knowing the impact that would have on its survival and what that would mean to relationships with the Arab world. So that they left the Muslim authority in charge of the top of the Temple Mount. The Muslim authority decided to do digging there to try to remove any references to Jewish history there that would allow Jews to lay claim to historically to the Temple Mount that would precede the Muslims being there. So the Muslims got there only in the 7th century CE, right? That's how old the Al-Aqsa Mosque is. That's on top of the Temple Mount. So of course, Jews have been there before. Everybody knows that Jews have been there before, but the Muslim authority doesn't want people to know that. And they've just been digging up the ground there and just dumping the dirt over the side. So the Israel Antiquities or Archaeological Society has been sifting through that dirt, finding tremendous stuff that some of it dates back to the first temple in Jerusalem, including an amulet, like a metal scroll that has the priestly blessing on it. So that's fascinating. And that says that the version of the priestly blessing found in chapter 6 in the book of Numbers, one line of which is above the ark in our sanctuary, Ya'er Adonai Panav Elecha V'Yichuneka. So the 3 lines of the priestly blessing we know goes back to at least First Temple times. Now the Shema and the V'Ahavta is on a mezuzah, right? That's on the scroll on the mezuzah. I remember learning that they found in archaeological discoveries that people used to chisel those words onto their doorpost. Instead of having a case and putting a scroll inside the case, which we do today with mezuzot, it's called a mezuzah because it's put on the mezuzah, which is the doorpost. But I remember reading about an archaeological discovery about how the words were actually chiseled onto the doorpost. But how old was that doorpost, I don't know. So it's possible that the Shema V'Ahavta, the priestly blessing, are ancient prayers that go way back, but were they part of an already written Torah? We don't know. So there's a lot of questions here. So, the questions about the authorship of the Torah are very different than if we were Christians to try to prove that Jesus existed. Okay, so that question for Christianity is a very, very serious question, right? So people, if you are a believing Christian, you believe that Jesus existed, you believe that Jesus was crucified, you believe that Jesus was buried, and you believe that Jesus was resurrected 3 days later. So you have to believe that. However, there's no historical proof that Jesus existed. So it's not a problem for me, a non-Christian, to ask questions about that. But it is a problem for Christians to ask questions about that. And for archaeology or history to discover that either Jesus did not exist or that he did exist, but not in a way that the Christian Bible depicts it. So there are lots more questions if you're a Christian about the historicity of Jesus than there is if you're a Jew about the authorship of the Torah. Because frankly, it doesn't matter who wrote the Torah or when the Torah was written. What matters is that we are Jews because the rabbis created Judaism as we know it around 2,000 years ago. That's what matters. And the basis for rabbinic Judaism is the Torah. Okay, so we believe there's something divine to the Torah itself. So that's belief and that's faith. Does it matter that events in the Torah happened or not? No, ultimately it doesn't matter. So there are a lot of questions came out when scholars suggested that the Exodus from Egypt never happened, right? Rabbi David Wolpe at Sinai Temple dared to give a sermon on Passover 10, 15 years ago, suggesting that the Exodus didn't happen. So it made an uproar in the Jewish social media world at the time. How dare a conservative rabbi, the famous Rabbi David Wolpe, suggests that? Well, obviously he did it on purpose to raise hackles and to get people to stay awake during the service, but it really ultimately doesn't matter. It's part of our tradition that the Exodus happened, but it doesn't matter if we prove it or don't prove it. Or what was the path that the Israelites took through the desert? If you look at the maps again, there's one map. The second map of the collection of maps in the Eitz Chaim has several red lines through the Sinai to suggest different routes the Israelites might have taken through the Sinai. Even some scholars suggest that Mount Sinai may have been in Saudi Arabia and not in the Sinai Peninsula. So I've told this story many times before. I was on a trip when I was in my junior year at Hebrew University. Before the school year began, there was a trip for overseas students to the Sinai. It had just been given back to Egypt, so we needed our passports with us to go into the Sinai Peninsula. And we climb Mount Sinai, we get to the top, and the guide tells us, we're not really sure if this is Mount Sinai. That it's traditional that this is after we woke up at dawn to climb the mountain, hike up the mountain at dawn. We do all that work, get up to the top. Oh, by the way, this may not be Mount Sinai, but there's a monastery on the foot of Mount Sinai, Santa Caterina. The monks there thought that was Mount Sinai based on tradition of the nomadic tribes going through there, because it's called Jebel Musa, Mount Moses, in Arabic Bedouin tradition too. So was that Mount Sinai? We don't know. So again, it really doesn't matter, even for religious Jews, as to when the Torah was written, who wrote the Torah, right? It just raises, just makes for interesting and challenging and provocative essays if you suggest a different theory than the traditional perspective. But we can't ignore the fact that, as Jeffrey Teague's introduction points out, and the below the line on 981, that commentary points out, that there are differences in the book of Deuteronomy in style and in law than we have in the book of Exodus. And let me just point out one thing, just as to kind of conclude this introduction to the book of Deuteronomy. If we look ahead to next week's portion, we're not going to be as I said before we started today, we're not going to be meeting for the next 2 weeks because I'll be away on very brief vacations. If we look at the 10 Commandments as they are presented in next week's portion, we have on page 1019, so turn to page 1019, which is chapter 5, verse 12 of Deuteronomy, whatever edition of the Torah you have. Keep your place there and turn back to Exodus chapter 20. Just a second, because that's the first edition of the 10 Commandments. And that is for Shabbat, chapter 20, verse 8, page 445. So we have 445 in Exodus, the law of Shabbat and the 10 Commandments, and 1019 in Eitz Chaim, chapter 5, verse 12, the law for Shabbat for Deuteronomy. So if we look at the Exodus version, it starts, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. Who? You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea, and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Okay, so here, remember the Sabbath day. You, your son, daughter, male, female, slave, cattle, stranger, don't do work. And the reason we observe Shabbat is to remember creation. Here in Deuteronomy, page 1019, observe the Sabbath day. It says shamor. In Exodus, it says zachor. So 2 different words for the 10 Commandments, shamor or zachor. Do you observe it or do you remember it? Okay, so here, observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor, do all your work. 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. Who? You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or your ass or any of your cattle, or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. It adds that line. The Exodus doesn't say that, just says that they rest. But here, an extra emphasis that your slave has to rest just like you do. Okay, that could have been implied from the Exodus one, that here in Deuteronomy has to add that extra line so we understand that the slave deserves a day of rest just like we do. And then remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. We observe Shabbat in Deuteronomy because of the Exodus, because remembering that we were slaves. We observe Shabbat in Exodus to remember the creation of the world. So these could be minor points, but when we say Kiddush on Friday night, Kiddush over a cup of wine or grape juice, we have both reasons for observing Shabbat, to remember creation and to remember that we were slaves, both of them incorporated into Kiddush. Okay, so the rabbis maintain those 2 reasons for Shabbat in the Kiddush itself, and ignore the fact that if Moses is recounting to the people what the 10 Commandments are, ignoring the fact that it's completely different. Not completely, it's just different. If Moses is the one who heard the 10 Commandments given by God on Mount Sinai in Exodus, how do you forget that? Even the first word of it, Zachor, how do you come up with Shamor instead of Zachor from what you heard? The very first word, at least that should have been the same. So that's why rabbis in subsequent generations, when we sing Lecha Dodi on Friday night in the Kabbalat Shabbat service, Lecha Dodi Likra Kala. So the very first stanza is Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad. Shamor, observe this. Observe the Sabbath day. Zachor, remember the Sabbath day. Shamor v'Zachor were spoken at once. So the rabbis make up for the discrepancy, this challenge of the difference between the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy versus the 10 Commandments in Exodus by saying it was a miracle. Only God can say two things at the exact same time. You try it as a human being. You can't say two words at the exact same time. It's just impossible. You can't say two words at the same time. But we're not God. Only God can say it at the same time. So the miracle was not only did God say it, but it was written on the 10 Commandments that way. The two different versions written on the 10 Commandments. Well, God wrote chiseled the 10 Commandments, so God could have done it in a way that these words would not have fallen off, or they would still all be there in that way. So that to maintain the traditionalist view that the entire Torah was written by God, how do you understand the discrepancy? You understand that it was a miracle, that God spoke the two versions at the exact same time. And so perhaps Moses then is remembering one version that he wrote in the book of Exodus and the other version that he wrote in Deuteronomy. So that just highlights that commandment for Shabbat highlights a theme that is throughout the book of Deuteronomy, taking care of the poor and disadvantaged, the underclasses of society. And so that is a focus of Deuteronomy. And so that perhaps is a comment on Israelite society. If Deuteronomy was written later than all the other books, Deuteronomy then is a comment on Israelite society at the time and how it needs to reform. Or it could be a challenge for the future. Make sure, as a hallmark of Jewish Israelite society, we need to take care of the poor and the disadvantaged. So these are the questions that arise. And I'll conclude with this. Let me say, before I conclude with one other comment. Anybody have any questions or comments about this? So the one comment I would say that the portion Devarim is always in the calendar on the Shabbat before the fast day of Tisha B'Av. So next Wednesday night is Tisha B'Av and Thursday morning. So Devarim is always read before it, and the Haftarah for the portion Devarim, which Rita is going to chant this Shabbat in memory of her father, is chanted mostly in the trup of the Book of Lamentations to get us into the mood for Tisha B'Av and the reading the book of Eicha. And so there is a verse that starts the second Aliyah, the second verse in the second Aliyah, if you turn to page 984, which gives a hint to Tisha B'Av and the Book of Lamentations. So 984, verses 11 and 12, Adonai Elohei Avotechem, Yosef Alechem Kachem Elef Pa'amim, Vivarech Etchem Kasher Diber Lachem. May the Lord, the God of your ancestors, increase your numbers 1,000-fold and bless you as he promised you. Eicha esa levadi, tarchachem umasa'achem verivchem. How can I bear unaided the trouble of you and the burden and the bickering? So when this is read, we're not going to be reading this coming Shabbat because we do a very abridged Torah reading. But if we were reading this in shul, whoever's the Torah reader would say, Adonai Elohei Avotechem, Yosef Alechem, Kachem Elef Pa'amim, Vivarech Etchem, Kasher Diber Lachem, regular Torah trup, Eicha Esa Levadi, Tarchachem Umasachem, Verivchem. Different trup. It's the trup for the Book of Lamentations to set the mood for Tisha B'Av the next week. And then you change the trup back to Torah and you keep on Avu Lachem, Chachamim, right? So there's that hint in the Torah to the calendar and how Devarim is always read on the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av. There's the hint in the Haftarah that Tisha B'Av is coming with chanting the bulk of it in Eicha Trup, and also in Kabbalat Shabbat, L'cha Dodi is supposed to be sung to the tune of one of the one of the most popular or well-known hymns that are sung on Wednesday night, on Tisha B'Av night, the tune Elit Zion, Elit Zion, da 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 da. So we do Lecha Dodi to that tune to also remind us that Tisha B'Av is coming. So that's what I wanted to say too about this portion. That's not just theological, religious challenges that the book of Deuteronomy presents to us, but also where it falls in the calendar and how that's reflected in the book too. So we'll stop here for today, and wish everybody to continued safety and health. And Rita, you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
Tisha B'Av, are we going to have a joint service?
Yes, we're doing it jointly with Tikvat Israel and B'nai Shalom of Only. Information is coming out about that shortly. We'll have it'll be 8 o'clock on Wednesday evening. It'll be on Zoom. There'll be a guest speaker, and then the service will be at 8:45. So that's
Have you assigned parts already for
yeah, parts have been assigned already, yeah. And
Okay.
then Thursday morning, we'll have the three will combine for the morning service as well. So
Okay, thank you.
yeah. So there'll be information about this coming out shortly with the Zoom links. Just a reminder again, the next 2 weeks we will not have class because I'll be away. But Sunday to Wednesday next week, and then Tuesday to Friday the following week I'll be away. So thanks to Paul to handle Minyan one night and Julian Liedman another time. And we'll see each other in this format 3 weeks from today. August 12th will be the next time we have Torah study. So take care, everybody. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shana.
You too.